Behind every bar, in the silence of death row or the endless grind of a life sentence, there's a story. Not just a story of crime, but of a fall. A moment when human life loses its worth, and loyalty to a gang becomes everything. Today, we'll tell you about those who walked that path to the end. Sean Tyson was just a teenager in the sun-drenched city of Sarasota, Florida, but he was already ensnared in the grim world of a local street gang. To his peers, he projected an image of toughness, a reputation built on petty crime, and a defiant attitude that masked deep-seated insecurity and a desperate craving for status within his circle. This was a world where respect was currency, and fear was its most powerful expression. The social environment was one of poverty and limited opportunity, where the allure of gang life offered a distorted sense of family and power. In April of 2011, this toxic pursuit of street credibility collided with the lives of two innocent British tourists, James Cooper and James Couzaris. The two men, lost and having wandered into Tyson's neighborhood by mistake, represented an opportunity. In what the prosecution described as a robbery gone horribly wrong, Tyson and a friend confronted them. The motive was tragically simple: robbery. But it was fueled by a deeper, more chilling impulse: the need to prove his own ruthlessness. When the tourists explained they had no money, Tyson, in a cold-blooded act of violence, shot them both dead. The murders sent shockwaves not just through Sarasota but across the Atlantic. The trial was a somber affair, revealing a young man who showed little remorse. He was portrayed as a product of his environment, yet also as a cold and calculating killer. In 2012, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. A BBC News report highlighted the tragic senselessness, stating the victims were killed for pennies or even nothing at all. When a life is valued so little that it can be extinguished for the mere performance of toughness, what does that say about the society that created the stage? Wayne Williams was a charismatic and ambitious freelance photographer and aspiring music producer in Atlanta, a man who desperately wanted to be seen as a success. He moved within the city's social circles, presenting himself as a talent scout, a persona that gave him access and a veneer of legitimacy. However, beneath this polished exterior was a man linked to one of the most terrifying chapters in the city's history: the Atlanta child murders. While not part of an organized gang, he was a predator operating within a specific social environment, exploiting the trust of young, aspiring musicians. Between 1979 and 1981, a string of at least 29 murders, mostly of African American children and adolescents, terrorized the city. The community lived in a state of constant fear and suspicion. Williams became the primary suspect when he was seen near where a body was discovered. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial, based on unique fibers from his home and car that were found on several victims. He was never charged with any of the child murders. Instead, in a controversial legal strategy, prosecutors charged him with the murders of 2 adults, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, and introduced evidence from 10 of the child cases to establish a pattern of behavior. The motive, prosecutors argued, was a complex mix of frustration over his failed career and a God complex, a desire to cleanse the streets of poor black children who he felt were giving the city a bad name. In 1982, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. To this day, he maintains his innocence, and the Atlanta child murders cases remain a source of pain and debate. When justice for so many victims rests on the conviction of one man for the crimes of 2, can a community ever truly heal? Samuel Diedemann was one half of a terrifying duo that plunged the city of Phoenix, Arizona, into a state of panic during a year-long reign of terror. Alongside his accomplice, Dale Hausner, Diedemann was a member of a small, self-styled criminal group that engaged in random, senseless violence. On the surface, Dietemann was a janitor and a heavy drinker, a seemingly unremarkable man. But beneath this mundane exterior lurked a profound emptiness and a capacity for chilling cruelty. He was easily influenced, drawn into Hausner's orbit and his dark, nihilistic worldview. Between 2005 and 2006, they became the serial shooters, cruising the streets at night, randomly targeting pedestrians, cyclists, and even animals in a series of drive-by shootings. Their crimes were disturbingly indiscriminate, a form of what they chillingly called recreational violence. They also committed arson, setting fire to stores and dumpsters for the sheer thrill of it. The motive was a horrifying void of reason. There was no robbery, no revenge, no clear ideological goal. It was violence for its own sake, a way to feel powerful and escape the crushing meaninglessness of their own lives. The investigation was a massive undertaking, with police struggling to connect the seemingly random attacks. A crucial tip from a friend of Dietemann's finally led police to the pair. In his confession, Dietemann admitted to his role in several of the shootings. He was convicted of 2 murders and other charges, receiving a sentence of life in prison without parole. One investigator described their spree as one of the most senseless series of crimes he had ever seen. When human life becomes a target in a game of nihilistic entertainment, what hope is there for finding reason in the aftermath? Luis Huero Buf Flores is a name etched into the very foundation of Chicano gang history. In 1957, within the bleak walls of the Duell Vocational Institution in California, he became the founder of the Mexican Mafia, or La M. Flores was not just a tough street kid. He possessed a visionary, albeit malevolent, charisma. He saw the disorganization among the warring Chicano street gangs and envisioned a gang of gangs, a syndicate that could command absolute loyalty and control the prison yards, and eventually, the streets. His personality was magnetic, capable of inspiring a fierce devotion that would become the bedrock of La M's power. The social context was the violent, factionalized world of the California youth prison system, where strength in numbers was the only law. Flores's crime was not a single act, but the creation of a monstrous entity. He established the gang's blood-in, blood-out oath and its rigid code of conduct, which included prohibitions against cowardice and informing. The primary motive was protection and power. Flores wanted to unite Chicano inmates against other prison factions and, in doing so, create a dominant force. This initial impulse soon morphed into a criminal enterprise focused on extortion and controlling the flow of narcotics. He laid the groundwork for the organization that would terrorize California for decades. For his role as the architect of this criminal empire, Flores would spend nearly his entire adult life in prison, ultimately receiving a life sentence for his leadership activities. Historical accounts of La M credit him with the original vision and structure of the gang. When a person's legacy is an institution built on violence and fear, one that will outlive him by generations, does that make his crime all the more profound? Tyler the Hulk Bingham stood as another titan within the brutal hierarchy of the Aryan Brotherhood, a man whose physical presence was as intimidating as his reputation. Alongside Barry Mills, he formed the leadership commission that governed the gang's violent activities across the federal prison system. Bingham was known for his unwavering commitment to the gang's white supremacist ideology and his volatile temper. He was less the strategist and more the enforcer, a figure who commanded respect through raw intimidation and a proven willingness to authorize extreme violence. His world was the closed, suffocating society of maximum security prisons, a place of constant tension and racial strife where the Aryan Brotherhood carved out its territory with iron and blood. His crimes were those of a kingpin, centered on maintaining the gang's power structure. He was deeply involved in directing racketeering operations and, crucially, sanctioning murders. Under his leadership, the gang was responsible for a reign of terror, targeting black inmates in what prosecutors described as a race war, as well as killing suspected informants to protect their operations. The motive was twofold: to enforce the gang's racist doctrine and to solidify its control over the lucrative prison drug trade. The pursuit of power was inextricably linked with a hateful ideology. His leadership role was central to the landmark 2006 RICO case that aimed to dismantle the gang's command. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, effectively removing one of the pillars of the Aryan Brotherhood's power structure. According to court documents, Bingham and Mills were considered the de facto rulers of the gang. How does a man become so consumed by a creed of hate that he can order death from a distance, turning his prison cell into a command center for murder? Ronnie Lee Gardner's life was a spiral of violence, a tragic trajectory shaped by a volatile upbringing and an early entry into Utah's criminal underworld. He was known as a man who operated by his own brutal code, a member of a criminal group whose reputation was built on intimidation and force. His personality was marked by a fierce, almost self-destructive defiance against any form of authority, a trait that would define his entire existence. In 1984, during a robbery at a bar, this defiance exploded into murder when he shot and killed a bartender named Melvin Otterstrom. The crime was brazen, driven by a raw and impulsive aggression, but it was his next act that cemented his notoriety. In 1985, during a court hearing for the Otterstrom murder, Gardner was slipped a gun. In a chaotic and desperate bid for freedom, he opened fire, wounding a court bailiff and killing an attorney, Michael Burdell, in a shocking betrayal of the sanctity of the justice system itself. The motive for the escape attempt was clear, but the murder of the lawyer was a cold-blooded act, born of panic and a complete disregard for human life. The community was horrified by the courthouse shooting, an attack on the very institution meant to deliver justice. Gardner was eventually sentenced to life. But his continued defiance and the heinous nature of his crimes led prosecutors to seek the death penalty. For years, he fought his execution, becoming a symbol of the debate over capital punishment. Before his execution by firing squad in 2010, he reportedly said he had made his peace. But can peace truly be found after a life built on such a foundation of violence? And does the state-sanctioned taking of a life truly provide closure for the chaos he created? Robert "Blinky" Yeager was a key figure within the machinery of the Aryan Brotherhood. A man who, despite not being one of its ultimate leaders like Mills or Bingham, was a critical enforcer and high-ranking member. His reputation was that of a loyal and utterly ruthless soldier, a man trusted to carry out the gang's most sensitive and violent directives. He was a product of the federal prison system, a hardened inmate who found purpose and identity within the rigid, hierarchical structure of the brand. He operated within a world defined by extreme racial tension and a constant simmering threat of violence, where loyalty to the gang was the only thing that mattered. Yeager's crimes were a direct reflection of his role. He was deeply implicated in the gang's racketeering enterprise, which included drug distribution and extortion. More gravely, he was involved in carrying out the murder orders that came down from the leadership. He was the hand that executed the will of the Commission, a vital link in the chain of command that made the Aryan Brotherhood so deadly. The motive for his actions was a powerful sense of belonging and a commitment to the gang's violent code. For men like Yeager, the Brotherhood was more than a gang. It was a family, a religion, and a way of life worth killing for. His participation in the gang's criminal conspiracy brought him to the attention of federal prosecutors in the same sweeping RICO indictment that targeted the rest of the leadership. In 2006, he was convicted for his role in the gang's murderous activities and sentenced to life in prison. Case files from the trial show his direct involvement in enforcing the gang's brutal discipline. What drives a man to pledge such absolute, murderous loyalty to a cause forged in hatred and violence? Samuel Little, a man whose transient life left a wake of unimaginable sorrow, was a ghost drifting through the underbelly of America for decades. On the surface, he was a former boxer, a charismatic drifter with a disarming smile, easily blending into the marginalized communities he preyed upon. He navigated the fringes, often associated with local criminal circles and gangs, which provided him the anonymity he needed to become the most prolific serial killer in American history. His hunting grounds were the desperate streets of countless cities from the 1970s to the 2005s. Little's evil was a slow-burning fire, meticulously calculated. He targeted vulnerable women, often prostitutes or drug addicts, believing their disappearances would go unnoticed, their lives deemed insignificant by a society that had already cast them aside. He would knock them out with powerful punches before strangling them, a method that often left little evidence of foul play, allowing him to evade justice for nearly half a century. His motive was a chilling cocktail of rage, control, and a deep-seated hatred. The act of strangulation was deeply personal, a final, horrifying exertion of power over his victims. It wasn't until a breakthrough in DNA evidence in 2012 linked him to 3 cold cases in Los Angeles that his web of horror began to unravel. Sentenced to life in prison without parole in 2014, the full, horrifying scope of his deeds only came to light when he began confessing to a Texas Ranger in 2018. The FBI confirmed his involvement in at least 60 murders, though he claimed 93. His confessions, detailed and remorseless, were a final act of horrifying ego. As he told investigators, "I was good to them." How can one man harbor such a vast, dark ocean of violence, moving through the world unseen and unheard? For so long, Jeffrey Dahmer's name is synonymous with some of the most grotesque crimes of the 20th century. He was a deeply disturbed and isolated individual, whose quiet, unassuming demeanor hid a horrifying inner world. While not a gang member in the traditional sense, his life was deeply enmeshed in a criminal underworld of his own making, operating within the shadows of Milwaukee. His connections to the city's transient and marginalized communities allowed him to find his victims with terrifying ease. He presented himself as a friendly, lonely man, offering money or drinks, a mask of harmlessness that concealed his true, monstrous intentions. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered and dismembered 17 young men and boys. His crimes were the horrifying culmination of lifelong fantasies of domination and control, escalating from murder to acts of necrophilia and cannibalism in a desperate, twisted attempt to prevent his victims from ever leaving him. The motive was a profoundly pathological loneliness and an obsessive desire for total possession of another person. He did not kill out of anger, but out of a terrifying need to turn living human beings into compliant objects. His eventual capture in 1991 revealed a house of horrors that shocked the world. He was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms. While in prison, Dahmer was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. The judge at his sentencing declared that he was looking for the incarnation of evil. When the human need for connection becomes so perversely twisted, where does society draw the line between madness and pure, calculated evil? René Boxer. Enriquez's story is one of a dramatic and perilous transformation, from a feared enforcer in the Mexican mafia to its most high-profile defector. For years, he was the embodiment of La Yime's brutal ethos, a charismatic and intelligent member who rose through the ranks to become a powerful shot caller. He was respected and feared, known for his unwavering loyalty and his capacity for calculated violence. He lived and breathed the gang's code within the treacherous political landscape of the California prison system. His crimes were numerous and grave. He personally committed 2 murders and was involved in orchestrating countless acts of extortion and drug trafficking on behalf of the gang. His hands were stained with the blood required to maintain his status and enforce La M's will. The motive, initially, was the classic cocktail of power, respect, and survival. He embraced the identity of a soldier and thrived on the adrenaline and authority it provided. But over time, a profound disillusionment began to set in. The endless cycle of violence, the internal betrayals, and the murder of a close friend on the orders of his own brothers shattered his faith in the organization he had dedicated his life to. Facing multiple life sentences, Enriquez made a shocking turn. He began to cooperate with law enforcement. His testimony provided an unprecedented insider's view into the secret workings of the Mexican mafia, helping to dismantle parts of the very empire he helped build. He remains in protective custody, a man marked for death by his former comrades. In his book, The Black Hand, he wrote about the internal decay of the gang's code. When the very loyalty you would kill for becomes a lie, is turning against it an act of betrayal or the ultimate act of self-preservation? Joe "Peg-Leg" Morgan was not merely a member of a gang. He was an architect of one of the most feared prison syndicates in American history, La M, the Mexican Mafia. Despite being of Croatian descent, his fluency in Spanish and his ruthless intelligence allowed him to rise through the ranks, eventually becoming one of its most powerful leaders. His reputation within the criminal world was legendary. He was a master strategist, a man who could command immense loyalty and mete out terrifying violence with a simple order from behind prison walls. He operated in the brutal ecosystem of the California prison system of the 1960s and 70s, a world where survival depended on strength, alliances, and absolute control. Morgan's genius was in transforming a loose collection of street toughs into a structured criminal enterprise that controlled drug trafficking, extortion, and murder, both inside and outside the prison gates. His crimes were not of passion, but of cold, hard business. He was the invisible hand guiding a wave of organized assassinations and narcotics operations. The motive was singular: power. He sought to build an empire from a prison cell, a shadow government that held life and death in its hands. In 1971, his reign was formally recognized by the justice system when he received a life sentence for his role in orchestrating the gang's vast criminal activities, including numerous contract killings. Despite being incarcerated, he continued to wield immense influence for decades. As detailed in historical accounts of La M, Morgan was the godfather who forged the gang's foundational alliances. When a single mind can build an empire of fear from the confines of a concrete cell, what does that reveal about the true nature of power and control? Angelo Buono Jr. was a man who wore a convincing mask of normalcy. To his neighbors in Glendale, California, he was an automobile upholsterer, a quiet and unremarkable family man. But this facade concealed a monstrous predator who, with his cousin Kenneth Bianchi, would become infamous as one of the hillside stranglers. Buono was the dominant sociopathic force in the partnership, a man with a deep-seated, violent misogyny and a chilling need for absolute control. He was part of the local criminal milieu, but his evil was of a far more personal and sadistic nature. Between 1977 and 1978, Buono and Bianchi embarked on a killing spree, kidnapping, raping, and murdering at least 9 young women and girls. They often posed as police officers to lure their victims into their car, a terrifying betrayal of trust. Their crimes were characterized by extreme brutality. The victims' bodies left discarded on hillsides around Los Angeles, seeding terror throughout the community. Buono's motive was a sickening fusion of sexual sadism and power. He derived gratification from the complete domination and suffering of his victims. The investigation stalled for months until Bianchi, arrested in Washington for another crime, began to confess, implicating his cousin in an attempt to feign multiple personality disorder. The subsequent trial of Angelo Buono was one of the longest and most expensive in American history, lasting nearly 2 years. In 1983, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A prosecutor famously called him the Great Pretender for his ability to hide his depravity. How can such an ordinary-seeming man harbor such an extraordinary capacity for evil, living a double life in plain sight? Barry, the Baron Mills, was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence within the desolate, racially charged world of the federal prison system. He was a principal leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, a notorious white supremacist prison gang. Mills was not a mindless thug. He was cunning, articulate, and possessed a chilling capacity for strategic violence. His personality was a paradox. He could be charming and persuasive, yet was utterly devoid of empathy, viewing murder as a necessary tool of business. He thrived in the brutal, segregated environment of maximum security prisons, where the Aryan Brotherhood, or the Brand, positioned itself as a key player in the high-stakes game of prison politics and illicit economies. His primary crimes were not committed with his own hands, but through his absolute authority. From his cell, he directed a vast criminal enterprise involved in racketeering, drug trafficking, and, most infamously, contract killings. The gang operated on a blood-in, blood-out philosophy, and Mills was its chief enforcer, ordering the murders of rivals and informants to maintain the gang's dominance. The motive was a twisted blend of ideology and power. While rooted in white supremacy, the gang's primary focus became profit and control over the prison drug trade. In 2006, after a massive federal investigation that spanned years, Mills and other leaders were convicted under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act. He was sentenced to life in prison for orchestrating murders and leading a criminal enterprise. The prosecution called him and his co-defendants a band of serial killers. When a man can turn a hateful ideology into a ruthlessly efficient killing machine from behind bars, where does the boundary between belief and pure criminality truly lie? These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The line between protector and predator can be terrifyingly thin. They remind us that the most devastating crimes often grow from a seed of corrupted humanity, nurtured in environments of desperation, hate, or profound emptiness. The consequences ripple outward, eroding faith not just in individuals, but in the very social structures meant to keep us safe. This raises a critical question for all of us. When the foundation of trust is so profoundly broken, how do we as a society begin to rebuild it? How can communities, particularly those most affected by such violence, foster a renewed faith in law enforcement and the justice system? Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments below. Your perspective is crucial to this conversation. If these stories resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the psychology of crime.